Concluding our examination of Bryant Wood's interpretation of the archaeological discoveries at Jericho, modern Tel El Sultan, in this program we focus on Wood's crowning argument for redating the remains at City 4, the layer at the ruins most associate with biblical Jericho. Wood believes he has found the evidence for correcting Kathleen Kenyon's date of 1550 BCE in the Middle Bronze period to 1400 BCE in the Late Bronze, corresponding nearly exactly with biblical chronology for when Joshua and the army of Israelites were said to have emerged from the Sinai wilderness to begin their conquest of the Promised Land. Wood has laid great emphasis on the pottery discovered at Jericho, particularly a very specific type, which he says conclusively proves Jericho fell in 1400. And does modern radiocarbon dating help finally establish Wood's argument and bring to rest the debate regarding the fall of Jericho? While Bryant Wood has made a number of assertions regarding the archaeology of Jericho and what he considers parallels with the biblical text, the foundation of his argument that the ruins of Jericho identified as City 4 should be redated to 1400 BCE rests largely with his interpretation of the pottery found by Garstang at the site. Wood considers himself an expert in Syro-Palestinian pottery of the Late Bronze Age, having studied in the 1970s and 80s.
And the subject of my dissertation was Canaanite pottery of the Late Bronze Age. Well, you might say, that sounds pretty boring. What would Canaanite pottery of the Late Bronze Age have to do with the Bible? Well, it turns out that we have to use pottery for dating. And dating is crucial for correlating what you're finding in an archaeological excavation with history.
But Wood is certainly not the final authority in identifying such pottery. In fact, Wood has had no peer-reviewed paper published regarding his work on the pottery of Jericho, other than the 1990 articles in the popular magazine Biblical Archaeology Review. Wood has had a number of articles published in Bible and Spade, but this is a magazine produced by his very own Associates for Biblical Research. The magazine boasts to be written from a scholarly and conservative viewpoint, supporting the inerrancy of the biblical record. Bible and Spade's editor is none other than Bryant Wood himself. Wood has claimed he is working on a larger paper detailing his work on the pottery of Jericho, but he has been making that claim for over a quarter century, and still no such paper has been published. The fact also remains that he has convinced no other expert in the field of his conclusions, and on the contrary, other experts disagree with him. Wood's main argument for redating the destruction of Jericho based upon the pottery discovered at the site turns on his claim that Kathleen Kenyon stated she did not find examples of something called Cypriot pottery, which she believed should have been there if the destruction occurred circa 1400 BCE. Cypriot pottery was an expensive imported pottery from Cyprus, hence the name, which was popular in the Late Bronze period, at the time the Bible places Joshua's destruction of Jericho. So Kenyon reasoned that if the destruction layer at City 4 had occurred sometime around 1400 BCE, there should be examples of this Cypriot pottery found in the ruins, but Kenyon found no evidence of such pottery. However, as Wood claims in his 1990 Bar article, Garstang found a considerable quantity of pottery decorated with red and black paint, which appears to be imported Cypriot bichromeware, the type of pottery Kenyon was looking for and did not find. At the time of Garstang's excavation, the significance of this type of pottery was not recognized, so it was simply published along with all the other decorated pottery without being singled out for special notice. It showed up in erosional layers on the east side of the tell. On the east side of the tell there is another structure, known as the Middle Building, which is the only remaining structure from the final habitation of the area and dated to the Late Bronze period. It is evidence that following the destruction and abandonment of City 4, the area stayed unoccupied for quite some time before a later, much smaller village was constructed which left no evidence of a defensive wall. No one identifies this final habitation layer with the biblical Jericho of Joshua's conquest, but it was in relation to this building that the painted pottery Wood identifies as Cypriot bichromeware was found. Most would assume the pottery was contemporaneous with the Middle Building itself. Both the Middle Building and Cypriot pottery are from the Late Bronze period. But Wood has an ingenious invention which gets the pottery into the Middle Building from the older destruction layer of City 4, so that he can date both the pottery and City 4 to the Late Bronze. Wood writes in his 1990 Bar article that following the destruction of the Bronze Age city at Jericho, in reference to City 4, the destruction layer he identifies as the one associated with the biblical Joshua. Note he is careful not to call it the Middle Bronze Age city, as Kenyon identified it. The site lay abandoned for a considerable period of time. During this period, material from the top of the tell washed down the slopes, forming a thick layer of erosional debris. Toward the end of the Late Bronze 2A period, the second half of the 4th century BCE, a large palace or residency, Garstang's Middle Building, with its associated outbuildings, was built into the erosional layer on the east side of the tell. The Middle Building was occupied only for a generation or so and then abandoned. After this abandonment, material again washed down from the higher elevations, covering the ruined building. Wood argues that the pottery Garstang recovered from the Middle Building was in fact washed down in these erosional layers from the older habitation layer of City 4. If the pottery washed down, and thus ultimately came from City 4 with evidence of burned buildings and a collapsed defensive wall, and if this apparently imported Cypriot pottery is only to be found in a Late Bronze Age context, then the conclusion is unavoidable. City 4, from which the Cypriot pottery came, according to Wood, was inhabited in the Late Bronze period. Its walls would have come tumbling down in the Late Bronze period, and the Late Bronze period fits perfectly with the biblical date for Jericho's destruction in circa 1400 BCE. The pottery Wood originally identified as Cypriot has markings on it from Garstang, which identify it as having come from this Middle Building, which itself dates to the Late Bronze. In other words, the pottery and the building are contemporaneous, and thus certainly no surprise that Late Bronze Age pottery should be found with a Late Bronze structure. However, in order for Wood to get a Late Bronze Age date assigned to City 4, he has to find a way to get the Cypriot pottery found in the Late Bronze Age Middle Building, to travel from the destruction layer of City 4, in which no examples of Cypriot pottery have been found, down into the Middle Building, thus linking the two. Would then merely need date the Middle Building to another period within the Late Bronze after the destruction of City 4. He does this by saying the pottery fortuitously washed from City 4 into the soil beneath the Middle Building during an erosional event between the dates of habitation. For Wood, the Middle Building and the so-called Cypriot pottery discovered there are not contemporaneous. The pottery is Late Bronze 1, while the Middle Building is Late Bronze 2. For Wood, the only way the pottery from Late Bronze 1 could have made it into a relationship with a Late Bronze 2 building as if it were washed there from a late Bronze I context. That context, of course, being City 4. So instead of City 4 being dated to 1550 BCE in the Middle Bronze, Wood redates it to Late Bronze I based upon the shards found from the Late Bronze Middle Building. So key to Wood's proposal to overturn Kenyon's date of Jericho is this argument regarding the Cypriot pottery, which features so prominently not only in his own presentations, but those of others supporting his conclusions. Pastor Don Patton, in utilizing Wood's arguments to support the historical reliability of the Bible, has said,
after Garstang had done his work, Kathleen Kenyon took over. She's one of the ones who we're told has modernized archaeology in Israel. And she says the city belonged to a much earlier time and could not be biblical Jericho based on the absence of the imported Cypriot ware pottery. This is special pottery from Cyprus. That should be there if this is Joshua's time. And there's some fairly reasonable conclusions regarding that. She dug and she didn't find it. And so she concluded it couldn't be Joshua's Jericho. She did acknowledge that things were burnt and the walls had fallen. The lack of pottery proved that it could not be Joshua's Jericho. And then she died, fortunately. We'll have more to say about her later. Bryant Wood began to work there in the late 90s and after the turn of the century and found exactly what she said would indicate that it was Joshua's Jericho, but she says it wasn't there. He found that it was. This is expensive pottery. She was digging in the poor part of the city. He said you ought to look in the prosperous part, and he found lots of it.
But Don Patton is incorrect. Wood has not personally uncovered any examples of Cypriot pottery. Wood has unearthed no pottery at the site. Wood's examination of Jericho is limited only to going over the pottery already unearthed by Garstang and Kenyon. Wood has done no original work at the site to support his conclusions, and in fact, the pottery Wood originally claimed appeared to be imported Cypriot bichromeware was challenged in 1990 by another researcher in the field, Peter Bienkowski. Bienkowski, who literally wrote the book on Late Bronze Age pottery in 1986, titled Jericho in the Late Bronze Age, takes great exception to Wood's conclusions regarding the pottery. Bienkowski was the former head of antiquities at the National Museums, Liverpool, held the position of curator of Egyptian and Near Eastern antiquities, National Museums and Galleries on Merseyside, and most recently as deputy and acting director of Manchester Museum, one of the UK's biggest multidisciplinary university museums. Bienkowski's background is in archaeology, particularly of the Middle East and Egypt, and has been published extensively in the field, including textbooks and in peer-reviewed journals. In a 1990 reply to Wood's assertions, also published in Biblical Archaeology Review, Bienkowski wrote that the pottery Wood identified as imported Cypriot ware was instead examples of local pottery dating to the Late Bronze II period. Wood's response at the time was, "Not so." Wood emphatically defended his identification of the pottery as Cypriot by stating, "The fabric of the Jericho bichrome pottery is much different than the local Late Bronze II wares. The fabric of Late Bronze II pottery generally is of a poor quality. It has large grits and is not fired all the way through. The Jericho bichrome pottery, on the other hand, is of a high quality. It is the pinkish buff, levigated fabric common to Cypriot bichrome ware. It has a finely ground temper, all but invisible to the naked eye, and is well fired with no core." In order to confirm his identification of the Cypriot bichromeware as such, Wood subsequently had the pottery tested by means of neutron activation analysis to determine the source of the pottery. It turned out Bienkowski was correct. The pottery was locally made and not imported from Cyprus. However, local bichromeware was also discovered in the nearby tombs, and it too has been dated to the Late Bronze II period. It must be remembered that these tombs were used by the inhabitants of City 4, and the pottery found there is dated to the Middle Bronze. After the city was destroyed, use of the tombs ceased as well, until another village was built on the site, the habitation identified with the Middle Building, and dated to the Late Bronze. At that time, the tombs were reused again, and the older Middle Bronze artifacts pushed aside. If the earlier Middle Bronze city, with the collapsed wall and dated by Kenyon to have been destroyed in 1550 BCE, should instead be dated to have been destroyed in circa 1400 BCE, then pottery from that city and era would overlap with the late bronze pottery from the tombs outside the mound, dated there to be from 1425 to 1275 BCE. But in fact, no such overlap exists. There is a clear distinction between the tomb late bronze pottery and the pottery from the Middle Bronze city, indicating a substantial gap. The matter of Wood's interpretation of the pottery ultimately can't be settled, however, until he publishes his ideas for peer review, where other experts in the field can properly evaluate his arguments. But doing so will expose Wood's ideas formally to the scientific community once and for all, and if he fails to convince others of his conclusions, he may put in jeopardy everything else he's worked to build, including his Associates for Biblical Research ministry, and that may be a gamble Wood is not willing to make. But perhaps the most compelling evidence for Jericho's destruction at a date matching the biblical chronology for the city's conquest in 1400 BCE was a small sample of charcoal taken from the site and discussed by Wood in his 1990 Bar article. Wood wrote at the time, "One carbon-14 sample was taken from a piece of charcoal found in the destruction debris of the final Bronze Age city. It was dated to 1410 BCE, plus or minus 40 years. Lending further support to the view that the destruction of City 4 occurred around the end of the Late Bronze 1 period, about 1400 BCE. An objective radiocarbon date, not open to interpretation or to desires to prove the Bible historically accurate, certainly would help cement Wood's argument and overturn Kenyon's Middle Bronze dating of the site. However, it was not to last. As James Weinstein pointed out in his examination of Wood's evidence for Jericho,
an unfortunate flaw in Woods' argument is his use of a radiocarbon assay that the British Museum Laboratory had already identified as part of a large series of systematically defective dates. The revised radiocarbon age for this sample is 220 years earlier than the one cited in the original excavation report and used by Wood, and when calibrated and turned into a calendrical date, is completely consistent with the traditional dating for the Middle Bronze II remains at Jericho.
radiocarbon dating works by measuring the rate of decay of carbon-14 in a tested sample. The nucleus of a carbon-14 atom is unstable. At some time, this unstable nucleus will emit a high-energy electron called a beta particle, which has a 1- charge. The beta particle causes a neutron to change to a proton, and the carbon-14 atom then decays into a nitrogen-14 atom. The average time for half of a group of carbon-14 atoms to decay is 5,730 years and is called a half-life. A charcoal sample, or any other object containing carbon, when tested, will be found to contain a certain percent of carbon-14, and that percentage is used to calculate the age of the sample. Carbon-14 samples can be accurately dated up to 60,000 years old. What had happened with Wood's sample was that the British Museum found that their radiocarbon measurement apparatus had gone out of calibration for a period of time, and that time coincided with when the sample Wood cites had been measured. Consequently, that testing yielded incorrect dates, and it was this dating which appeared to support Wood's claim that Jericho had been destroyed in 1400 BCE. And the situation did not improve for Wood in the intervening decade, as in 1995 and 2000, more samples of carbon and charred cereal grains were taken from the early and Bronze Age layers at Jericho and tested, the results of which largely favored Kenyon's dating of 1550 BCE. In total, 9 samples have been tested from Jericho, 1 from the 1980s, 6 from 1995, and 2 more from the late 1990s by an Italian team which had been re-excavating the ruins. Of those 9, 5 fall well within the normally accepted date for the Middle Bronze Age, although 1 falls between the 17th and 15th centuries BCE. 1 is considerably earlier, within the Early Bronze Age. 1 is considerably later, well within the Late Bronze, and the last 2 date between 1523 to 1411 BCE and 1432 to 1262 BCE. While there are quite wide variations in dates from the same level, although not all were taken from the same context, this is quite normal at any archaeological site, and shows how difficult it can be to use C14 dates sensibly on their own. This is usually because samples can get very easily contaminated with other material, which skews the date. But it remains true that there are 2 C14 dates which Bryant Wood can claim fall roughly into the time he claims Middle Bronze Jericho was destroyed. Against him, there are 5 dates which support Kenyon's conclusion, plus 2 others which show incompatible dates with either Wood or Kenyon. The balance of probabilities favors the 5, which show a roughly consistent date, that of the Middle Bronze period, and Kenyon's date of 1550 BCE for the destruction of Jericho's City 4. Wood now distances himself from the radiocarbon dating, noting, C14 dates are consistently 100 to 150 years earlier than historical dates. There is a heated debate going on among scholars concerning this, especially with regard to the date of the eruption of Thera. Because of the inconsistencies and uncertainties of C14 dating, most archaeologists prefer historical dates over C14 dates. Of course, this was not Wood's tune in 1990 when the radiocarbon sample seemed to support his biblically driven conclusion regarding Jericho. At that time, it was part of a larger body of evidence he believed converges to demonstrate that City 4 was destroyed in about 1400 BCE, not 1550 BCE as Kenyon maintained. And at that time, Wood noted the dating sample was only off by plus or minus 40 years, not 100 to 150 as he does today. And besides, C14 dates are decidedly not 100 to 150 years earlier than historical dates. Once that early sample was shown to be in Kenyon's favor, it suddenly became unreliable, as all the other samples subsequently are apparently. For Wood, regardless of what the radiocarbon dating shows, he retains his preferred date of Jericho's destruction, instead relying largely on his own interpretation of recovered pottery. If the radiocarbon dating shows a date of 1400 BCE, then that proves his theory. If the radiocarbon dating does not line up with the biblical chronology, then the C14 samples become unreliable based upon a larger ongoing dispute over the dating methods. Either way, Wood is going to have Jericho destroyed in 1400 BCE, just as the Bible indicates. Unlike Kaufman at Troy, Wood has made no new discoveries at Jericho, nothing which would overturn the accepted date for the destruction layer. Wood has merely tried to resurrect an early 20th century, academically discarded, biblically based dating for the conquest of Jericho. Wood sees parallels between the biblical story and the archaeology where either none exist, or he tries to force-fit the data so that it creates the illusion of coherence. In the end, Bryant Wood's claims have not been accepted by any other competent archaeologist. In Kenneth Kitchen's 2003 landmark book on the reliability of the Old Testament, where Wood might stand a chance of recognition for his efforts by the conservative scholar if his ideas held any weight, Kitchen does not give Wood's thesis so much as a single word in his detailed examination of the archaeology of the Holy Land. In Lester Grabb, professor of the Hebrew Bible and early Judaism at the University of Hull's book, Ancient Israel, Wood is mentioned, but only as a relic of Albright's abandoned school of biblical archaeology. Wood is described as a die-hard evangelical conservative, one of a diminishing minority who cling to the hope that the Bible will yet be proven true by archaeology. Experts in the field, not driven by a faith-based need to solve conflicts between the findings of archaeology and science and the Bible, still accept that the destruction of City 4 at Tel El Sultan should be dated to 1550 BCE, and modern academic efforts to understand the settlement patterns of early Israel have left evangelicals like Wood far behind. With Wood's argument unsupported by peer review, and much of his conclusions driven by his evangelical commitment to the literal interpretation of the Bible rather than an unbiased assessment of the actual facts, could there yet be hope in aligning the destruction layer of City 4 with the biblical story of Jericho's destruction? In our next episode, we will examine just such a hope in a novel approach to the problem by way of creation of a new chronology, which just might rewrite not only the story of Jericho, but that of the entire ancient Near East history.
Well, Joshua fit the battle around Jericho, around Jericho, around Jericho. Joshua fit the battle around Jericho, and the walls came tumbling down. God knows then Joshua fit the battle around Jericho, around Jericho, around Jericho. Joshua fit the battle around Jericho, and the walls came tumbling down. Good morning, Sister Mary. Good morning, Brother John. I want to stop and talk with you just to tell you how I come along. I know you've heard of Joshua. He was the son of Nun. Well, he never stopped his working with God until his work was done. The God that Joshua fit the battle around Jericho, around Jericho, around Jericho. Joshua fit the battle around Jericho, and the walls came tumbling down. You may talk about the men of Gideon. You may talk about the men of Saul. There's none like good old Joshua at the battle of Jericho. They tell me, good God, that Joshua's spear was well nigh 5 feet long. Then upon his hips was a double-edged sword, in his mouth was a gospel horn. But bold and brave, he stood salvation on his way. Good blow the ram hole, the Joshua cried, get the battle, and in my hand I got the battle around Jericho, around Jericho, around Jericho. Joshua fit the battle around Jericho, and the walls came tumbling down. Up to the walls of Jericho, he marched with his spear in his hand. Good blow the ram hole, Joshua cried, get the battle, and in my hand. Then the ram, lamb, sheep, horn began to blow, the trumpet began to sound. Oh, Joshua shouted, glory! And the walls come tumbling down. They got the battle around Jericho, around Jericho, around Jericho. Joshua fit the battle around Jericho, and the walls came tumbling down, 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 tumbling down.